Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second. I think one other person might be coming, but based on Slack, I don't think there's a ton. Um, so throughout the stream, if you guys have any questions, like feel free to put them in the chat. I'm gonna wait like 30 more seconds to see if the other person shows up. And if not, we can go ahead and get started. So while we're waiting, if you want to like type in your name, where you're from, how you're feeling about AP Gov in the chat, that would be cool so that I know a little bit more about you. And then I'll introduce myself in just a little bit when we get started. And then throughout the presentation, like feel free to unmute yourself and talk that way. If you've been to a Fiveable stream in the past, I know that, well, if you've been to a Fiveable stream like last year, I know you guys can like unmute yourself and talk that way, but this year that's definitely an option. So especially since there's not many people, if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question or put a question in the chat, then that would be great. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. So to start out, if you guys would like just type something in the chat just to let me know that you can hear me, and then maybe tell me a little bit about you, like where you're from, and if you are feeling good about AP Gov, not about AP, not good about AP Gov, anything like that. Hey, so Anjali's from Denver. That's cool. I've literally never been off the East Coast. So I've been like everywhere on the East Coast except, and then nowhere off. So love to visit sometime. Denver seems like a cool place. And then Lakshmi and there's one more person, I think. Avia, if you guys could introduce yourself in the chat, and then I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So I know a lot of you guys have said that you are wanting to either take AP Gov in the spring or are already taking AP Gov, but the Unit 1 is really just more of a review from your past US history classes, especially if you're a junior or senior taking the class. A lot of Unit 1 is stuff from the past with some extra like specific government related topics embedded within the course. So as always, remember to follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We're frequent in posting, and we want to make sure that you're up to date with all of the different events that we have going on our website, which is fiveable.me. We now have resources for all 38, I believe, AP subjects, and more are getting published on a daily basis. So if you want to check that out, if you're taking a class other than AP Gov, that would be cool. And then also you could sign up for the Fiveable course in the spring, which will run. So a little bit about me. I know I said I would introduce myself, but my name is Akhilesh. I'm a senior from North Carolina, and this is my second full year with Fiveable. So last year I streamed it pretty much completely for AP Government, and then I also did the current event and weekly updates that we had last year. And then I think I did a few for like AP Environmental Science. I've written guides over the past 2 years for Spanish literature, Gov, and I believe I've written some for environmental science and a few other history classes as well. And I am the TA for Gov for this school year. So if you guys ever have any questions just with what you're learning or about the class, you're not sure whether you want to take it, just go ahead and send me a message on Slack and I'd be happy to help you. I've already had a few people just, reaching out with questions maybe that they're having trouble with, and that would be great. And you guys advertise these streams to your friends, so that way we can get more people involved with everything Fiveable has to offer. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Unit 1. So Unit 1, what I like to do at the beginning of every unit is pretty much split it up into the key topics that we'll be covering. So the first two standards in Unit 1 talk about just what is democracy. So Throughout this unit, the main theme is foundations of American democracy, but we're just going to talk about what democracy is in general. Then in the next three standards, those are all about the foundational documents. So if you don't know already, the AP US government class has a set of foundational documents that you need to be really familiar with by the end of the year when you're taking your AP exam. Because one of the free response questions on the AP exam deals specifically with the foundational documents, and you need to be able to synthesize evidence from these foundational documents to write your free response question. The next section is just about the principles of US government. So we're going to go off of a Federalist paper and talk about checks and balances. A lot of checks and balances will be covered in Unit 2, which in my opinion, that's like probably the most important unit because it teaches you a lot about how the government works. And you can make a lot of connections to your daily life and what you see. And then the last section is about federalism. So federalism is basically the relationship between the state government and the federal government. And that's what we will be talking about in those sections. So does anyone have any questions so far? Or anything you're confused about, things like that? Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing or the first standard is ideals of democracy. So does anyone know what like you need for there to be a democratic government, for you to say like this is a democracy? What are some characteristics of a democracy? Does anyone know? I know we don't have that many people, so okay, so we're sorry, the chat is like in a different place. Yeah, so active participation of the people. So a lot more involvement from the people in decision making, right? And do you know what inspired the like ideal of democracy or democracy itself? Like what specific event or time period led to people like wanting democracy or democratic government? Or people that influenced democratic government? Yeah, the revolution is an example, but even before the revolution, can you think of a time period that really emphasized like new thinking and democratic ideals and knowing what your rights are? Exactly, the Enlightenment. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Enlightenment itself. So the framers of the Constitution lived maybe not exactly during this time, but close enough where they were influenced by those Enlightenment ideals. So the traditional political views were challenged. So a lot of times before then, religion was used as a justification for governing people or for law or for authority. But during the Enlightenment, these traditional political views were challenged, and people were thinking like, why should I listen to you? Like before then, it was like, well, God put me here to govern. Well, why? So people started questioning a little bit more. And this meant that the relationship between the people and the government changed. So this like Enlightenment philosophy and those Enlightenment ideals were clear in the American colonies. So that's one of the reasons why the colonies began to oppose the British, because they were learning of all of these, new and different ideals that the British weren't following, right? The British pretty much had complete control over the American colonies. The American colonies had little to no freedom. And that's one of the reasons why we see this slow rise with the American colonies wanting independence. So the first document, and it is one of your foundational documents, is the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence was drafted by Thomas Jefferson, and it provides a foundation for popular sovereignty. So does anyone know what popular sovereignty is? Yeah, power of the people, and how the people play a part. Exactly. So basically, you're trying to figure out basically, how can the people play the most role in their government? Okay. Within the Declaration of Independence, basically what you need to know is that it was a list of grievances, and they were basically complaining about all of the abuses that the British throne was conducting or was going through in order to restrict the American colonies. And they used this to justify the need for a revolution. Now, the Declaration of Independence, that was a foundational document that was written before the US Constitution. The US Constitution itself is what provided the blueprint for democracy. So does anyone know when the Declaration of Independence was written or signed? What year? Yes, it was signed in 1776. And what about the Constitution? Right. So the Constitution was signed in 1787, almost, what is that, 11 years later. So the US Constitution provided this really detailed and very well thought out blueprint for democracy. Now, were there flaws? Obviously, right? And that's why we have so many amendments. But it provided a blueprint and it provided a guide for our democracy and that democratic process to get started. So some of the key principles of the Constitution included natural rights. So with Locke, we had life, liberty, and property. In the Constitution, really with the Declaration of Independence even, those natural rights were edited into life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So those are the three that you're probably familiar with. But John Locke, who was an Enlightenment thinker, he proposed life, liberty, and property. Popular sovereignty, that was something that we already discussed. Basically, the power of the state lies within the people, okay? And the main thinker that emphasized that is Rousseau. Now, another one of these principles is checks and balances and the separation of powers. So does anyone know who advocated for the separation of powers? Which Enlightenment thinker? So, oh, not Voltaire. Okay, so the person that advocated for the separation of powers was Montesquieu. Okay, so he believed that there should be divided authority within our government, and not one branch of government should have like all of the power. Which in our current day society, we see how there's that split up with the judicial, legislative, and the executive branch. Republicanism itself, the word means a representative style of government. So that is different from a pure democracy. So in a pure democracy, it's pretty much not feasible in the world we live in with 300 million people in a country. But republicanism basically says that you have a representative that advocates on your behalf in government. The social contract theory, which is something that I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with, is basically a contract, so a contractual agreement between the people that are ruling and the people that are being ruled. So the point is that the people that are ruling should be protecting the natural rights of those that are being ruled. Now, let's say there's a conflict and the people that are being ruled feel like their rights aren't being protected. Well, then they can revolt against those rulers or their government. Okay, and that's what that right to replace means. So the social contract theory itself is not our Constitution. However, it's an ideal that is kind of present within our Constitution and within the Declaration of Independence. So it's not necessarily the Constitution itself, but each of these principles are principles of government that are present in this development of American politics at the time. Okay, so does anyone have any questions on the ideals of democracy itself? Okay, so we're going to move into the types of democracy. So the first type of democracy is participatory democracy. What this means is that citizens have the power to decide directly on policy, which means they have like a direct vote. They are the ones that are deciding the policy itself. Now, does the United States have a completely participatory democracy, do you think? Right. So since it's through representatives, that means the US isn't necessarily a pure participatory democracy because the citizens don't have the right to decide directly on policy. So for example, if there's a law that's going through Congress, well, like I can't just vote for a bill to be passed, right? Because we couldn't like ask 300 million people every time we wanted a bill to be passed. So since the representatives are voting on our behalf, the US is not a completely participatory democracy. And with that being said, it's still not a direct democracy. So in a direct democracy, there is literally the citizens are meeting together to create this policy. With participatory democracy, it's something like a referendum where there's an opinion of all citizens being asked for a bill when a bill needs to be passed, if that makes sense. We're going to talk about some countries that have each of these in a minute. Okay, so the next thing is a pluralist democracy. So the United States does have, you could argue, a little bit of a pluralist democracy because of interest groups. So in a pluralist democracy, organized groups compete with each other to influence policy. So the reason why they do that is because of activism and because of their own beliefs. So it's not necessarily as a reason to like gain political favors or something like that, but instead it's because they are passionate about a certain policy. So you can see some examples with interest groups. They lobby and they testify in Congress and they try to stop or shape legislation. The third type of democracy that we're going to talk about is elite democracy. So the word elite itself, that you know means rich people or people that are in upper social classes, right? So that could kind of be a hint for you where an elite democracy means that there's a small number of people that are making those decisions. So those people are normally at the top, and they are the ones that are influencing this decision making. Oftentimes, this means that people with influence dominate, and it's only the richest of the rich or the people, again, at those higher social levels that are getting to make those decisions. So the Electoral College could be an example of an elite democracy. They are not technically like the richest of the rich or the people in the highest social classes, but it is an example where a small number of people are making a decision for a larger group of people. Okay, so now, and really in the past, there's always been some tension between which theory of democracy is best for the United States. So some documents that reflect this include the Constitution, Federalist 10, and Brutus 1. So even though everyone did want democracy, they didn't want a monarchy like Britain was at the time. The extent of the power of the federal government was the question, and was the reason why there were a lot of debates at that time. So, does anyone know the two groups that were fighting on how much power the federal government should have? Right, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So those were those two groups. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next standard. So the Federalists themselves, they favored a strong federal government. So another word for federal government is just national government. And they wanted a stronger national government. They wanted a stronger federal government. So if you don't really get anything out of this stream, that's something that you want to know is that Federalists favored a strong federal government. And later, when we talk about anti-federalists, they favored a stronger state government, which meant a weaker federal government. So those are the main differences between a federalist and an anti-federalist. And you can see kind of a comparison on the right side of your screen. So most of the people that favored the Federalists were landowners and wealthy people. And like I talked about, Anti-Federalists favored a strong state government. And they thought the Constitution, the way it was set up, would create an elitist type of democracy where only a small group of people were making decisions. So with what I just presented, what group of people do you think advocated for the passage or the ratification of the Constitution? The Federalists or the Anti-Federalists? Right, the Federalists. And you can, again, like I said before, you can see like a graphic on the right side here with who supported the Federalists and who supported the Anti-Federalists. You also probably want to know that Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, those were two of the key Federalists. And the Federalist papers that we'll talk about later, most of the times they were written by a few of those that are listed there. The Anti-Federalists, some examples were Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and again, with the Anti-Federalists in Brutus I, we can see some of their ideas reflected there. Okay, so the first foundational document that we're going to talk about is Federalist 10. And Federalist 10 was written by James Madison. But the Federalist Papers, first of all, like what they were, basically they were a series of 85 essays that were written by those three Federalists that I just talked about: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Federalist 10 basically said that political factions are undesirable, so they're not what we want, but they're inevitable. So does anyone know what a faction is? So a faction, or what it is basically like a small group of people that like they had a specific ideology or they had a specific belief. So a lot of times we can compare factions to interest groups. And what Madison said is that a large republic, so a bigger federal government, is best for this. And that's why he was advocating for the Constitution. So he said there were two ways to control factions: either remove their causes or control their effects. And what he said with removing their causes is that that would be practically impossible, because in order to have everyone have the same opinion, you'd have to destroy that concept of freedom and liberty, which is what America was built on. And you can't really just give citizens their own, like the same opinion, right? On the other hand, the other way to control factions would be to control their effects. So minority factions, if you have a large federal government or a large republic, it won't be able to assert itself as much because of the republic, right? So you don't really have like a small group of people that are suddenly taking over the government just because that's what they believe in. On the other hand, with majority factions, this means like a larger group of people that believe in one thing. Their effects are mitigated by representative government, right? And that's why he says factions, in order to control factions, a large republic is best. Okay. The next document we're going to talk about is the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation, basically it was a trash constitution. That's how I like to refer to it, because it was kind of stupid and it really didn't do anything for our government. It kind of laid the foundation at the beginning, but it was very ineffective. Okay, so with the Articles of Confederation, every state was sovereign, which basically means, like the title of the document, the United States of America wasn't necessarily like a united country, it was a confederation, literally. And any like ratification to the Articles of Confederation had to be approved by all 13 states. So if you think about it right now, if you tried to get all 50 states in our country to agree to make one change, that change would probably never happen, right? Because you have California, which is super liberal, and then you have states like Texas. Well, Texas is now changing, but you have states like Texas, which are super conservative. So you have these wide-ranging opinions, and it's unlikely you could get all 50 states to suddenly agree on something, right? In addition, the Articles of Confederation advocated for a weak federal government, which meant more power to the states. Unfortunately, what that meant was that the federal government couldn't tax the states. And then in addition, there was no judiciary and no executive. So that means we only had one branch of government, which was the legislature, and it was only one house. Okay. Every state had one vote, regardless of population. So if you think about that, Hawaii would have the same um, number of votes in the House as California. Okay, so obviously there's a difference, so that should be accounted for, which we do see in our present day government. In addition, in order to actually like approve a law or in order for a bill to pass, you would need 9 out of the 13 states to agree. Again, if you think about that with our Senate or with our House of Representatives, if you had to get 75 senators, which is about 75%, or it is 75%, to get something to pass, nothing would ever pass the Senate, right? So again, the Articles of Confederation were very weak. Basically, the reason why they were this way is because we had just gotten out of Britain, and Britain was very controlling, and we really didn't want to be in that same situation again. So I know there's really not many people to discuss, only one person, but a constitution itself, we could have discussed what that was. But a constitution is really just a set of laws, right? So the Articles of Confederation were technically our first constitution. And like I said, they didn't really establish a country, they established a firm league of friendship. We talked about unicameral Congress and legislative branch only, okay? Continuing on with the Articles of Confederation, Congress really couldn't enforce anything because there was no executive branch. So if you think about it, the 3 branches of government are the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. Your executive is the one that enforces, judicial interprets, and legislative makes the laws. So if you only have the legislative branch, you have no one to enforce and no one to interpret, right? So that wasn't very effective. So there was one key event that really demonstrated that we need a new government, and that was the Shays Rebellion. Okay, so with Shays Rebellion, it was at that time what was happening was that a lot of Massachusetts farmers were losing their land. They couldn't pay debt, even though they had served in the military before. And what they did was rebel, and they forced the judges to close court, and they really put up a big fight, right? But the central government or the federal government couldn't even shut down this rebellion. So that showed that we really needed this stronger central government in order to survive, which is why there became some discussions about what can we do to make the government stronger, and that's what we see with the U.S. Constitution. So does anyone have questions about the Articles of Confederation? Okay, so let's move on to talk about the Constitution. So the first thing that's addressed with College Board standards are a few compromises that were necessary in order to ratify the Constitution. So we know that there were a lot of different competing ideologies that were at play. However, there were a few compromises that they came to terms with when creating this Constitution. So this included the Great Compromise, how to structure the Electoral College, and the Three-Fifths Compromise. So does anyone know what any of these compromises are? So do you know what the Great Compromise is or the Three-Fifths Compromise? Yeah, so what's the Three-Fifths Compromise? Yeah, so at that time, basically what they were saying was with representation, a slave would count as only 3/5 of a person. So who do you think wanted slaves to count as a whole person? And then who do you think did not want slaves to count at all um, when coming to this compromise? So the North would have wanted slaves to not count, whereas the South would have wanted slaves to count as a person because the South had more slaves, right? So if the slaves were counted as full people in the South, well, then they would have more representation in government. And then the opposite for the North. Okay. Oh, I think there's another person. Okay, so even with all of these compromises, all matters weren't resolved, right? Another thing that we had to deal with the US Constitution was the amendment process. Um, let's see if I have that somewhere. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the Great Compromise. So that first slide was really an introduction to 1.5, but we're going to go into each of these in detail. So before the Great Compromise was reached and before we had this style of government, there were two different plans. So the Virginia plan was on behalf of large states. The New Jersey plan was on behalf of small states. So with the New Jersey plan, what they said was that there would be a one house legislature, which was unicameral, and there would be equal representation in Congress, which means all states would have the same number of representatives in Congress. Um, this was supported by smaller states because they didn't want their voices to be drowned out if it was based on population. So with the New Jersey plan, what house of our Congress now is this most like? So which house does it mirror in terms of equal representation for all states? Is it more like the Senate or more like the House of Representatives? So our current Senate has two senators from each state, right? So that's equal representation. So California has two senators, but so does Hawaii, and so does Alaska, and so does North Carolina. Okay, so every state has two senators. The Virginia plan, on the other hand, advocated for a bicameral Congress, but representation would be based on population. So that's more like the House of Representatives, where a state like California has a lot more representatives than a state like Hawaii, okay, because California has more people. And therefore, the Virginia plan was supported by larger states. So they had these two plans and they came to the Great Compromise, which created this two house Congress. So your first house is the Senate, where there was equal representation. And the second house was the House of Representatives, where it was proportional to the population itself. Okay. Then we talked about the 3/5 compromise. And basically, the framers agreed that all free persons, so at that time, pretty much all white people, would be counted as a whole person, and then slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Later, the 13th Amendment obviously abolished slavery. There was also a compromise made on how slaves would be imported to the United States. And basically, it placed limits and it kind of changed the timeline on this process. So the last thing is the amendment process and how to change the Constitution. I haven't really seen this appear on the AP exam a ton, but I know when I took the exam, I did have to choose which one of these was correct. So you could either have a 2/3 vote of both houses in Congress going to a 3/4 vote of the states. So either through the legislatures or a convention, or you could have a national convention that's called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. And then there could be a 3/4 approval. So to propose, it's 2/3, and then to ratify, it's 3/4. So this is something that you might just want to look at. I doubt it'll appear on maybe your unit test, but it could definitely be on an exam at some point. So throughout this unit and throughout future units, a key theme of AP government is how much power should the federal government have. So there's always been a debate over the role of the central government and the state government. So which one should have more power? And we can see that with like surveillance with 9/11. Should the central government be allowed to spy on us if they're trying to, save us from terrorism or protect us from possible terrorist attacks? Then you can also see that with public school education and how much the federal government should be involved with that. And then we'll see that in a case later with Engel versus Vitale. So the next thing, next standard is talking about the principles of American government. So one of the principles of American government that we already talked about was separation of powers. So we have three branches of government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch is talked about in Article 1, executive branch in Article 2, and judicial branch in Article 3. Okay. So we also see through this chart how each branch of government has checks and balances over each other. So a key check and balance that you probably want to remember with the judicial branch is that they have the power of judicial review, which means that the court can declare the actions of another branch unconstitutional. So either laws passed by Congress or maybe a presidential action as well. And you can see some of the other checks and balances here as well. So the Federalist paper that talks about separation of powers and checks and balances is Federalist number 51. So Federalist 51 is an important document because, first of all, it was written by James Madison. Okay. Oh, there's a chat. Do we have to know a lot of Supreme Court cases? So with the AP Gov class, there's 15 required Supreme Court cases that you must know. So beyond that, normally they don't test them because they have those required cases, but the 15 required cases you do need to know. And we will discuss 2 of them, I believe, today. So with Federalist 51, the reason why he said we should have separation of powers is because ambition needs to counteract ambition. So what he said was that each branch should have some set powers where individually they have some things that they should follow, but they can work independently of each other. The second thing that he said was that, sorry, I think I'm having some internet issues. Okay, so the second thing that he said was that all branches should not be elected by the people. So we see that already with the judicial branch and the executive branch and part of the legislative branch. So really the only groups or the only people in our government that we directly elect are our senators and the representatives to the House. The Electoral College elects the president, and the president nominates the Supreme Court justices and any other judges that serve in the federal circuits or the federal system. Okay. He especially emphasized that judges should not be elected by the people because they should serve without political pressure. And another thing that he emphasized was that power should be divided but not equal. He said that Congress should be the most powerful since they're the ones that are directly elected by the people, right? So like I said, only the senators and those representatives are elected directly by the people. And that way, they're also bicameral because they could check themselves. So the House can check the Senate and the Senate can check the House. Okay, so the next standard is going to move into federalism. So before we move into that, does anyone have any questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and move into federalism. This is just a graphic that you probably won't need to know, but it describes how there's different ways in which the relationship between states and the federal government can be structured. So under the Articles of Confederation, we were much like this diagram on the right, where the states had more power than the federal government. With a unitary system, the national government or the federal government has a lot more power than the states. Okay, with the federation or like federalism, the people is where the power comes from, and then the authority is divided between the states and the national government. So an example of this is the United States, because that's how it works here. Okay. So federalism itself, like a definition for that, is a system of government where the power is divided between the central government and regional governments. So two or more levels, so maybe your state and the country have authority over you, right? And there could be more. So it could be your regional government. For example, I live in the city of blank, so that city has authority over me. I live in North Carolina. North Carolina has authority over me. I live in the United States. United States has authority over me. And what that means is they can make laws which determine, how you go about your life, right? And the system of federalism was really a compromise that helped balance the worries of anti-federalists, especially because the Federalists were advocating for a very strong federal government. But with federalism, they could tell that the states did have certain powers, and that's only for the states. So you can see down here with this graphic of reserved powers, those are some things that only the state government can do. The federal government cannot do that. So a key power that you'd want to remember is schools. So anything regarding schools and setting up schools, that's reserved for the states. In addition, trade within the states is controlled by the state itself. So that's called intrastate commerce. Interstate commerce, which is between different states, is regulated by the federal government. So we have a few different types of powers. Expressed powers, another name for them is delegated powers or stated powers. Those are directly in the Constitution, and those are given to the federal government. Your concurrent powers are powers that are given to both the state government and the national government. Implied powers are powers that aren't directly stated, but could be implied based on the constitutional wording. And like I mentioned before, reserved powers are for the states. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is federalism, and specifically a few different types of federalism. So you have marble cake federalism and layer cake federalism. So with a marble cake, you can see how everything is kind of blended in between, right? You might not be able to cut a slice and like cut just the chocolate part and just the vanilla part. This is marble cake federalism, or it can represent marble cake federalism, because it's based on a mixing of our national government, our state government, and our local government. So it's not like the powers are clearly defined. Instead, there's a mix on who gets control over what. With layer cake federalism, it's very clear which part is the chocolate, which part is the vanilla. So that describes how a federal government has this specific set of powers, and the state government has this specific set of powers, right? So you can't really tell the difference. So the formal term for layer cake federalism is going to be dual federalism. Okay, so with dual federalism, you have like two spheres, and the national government is in one sphere, and the state government is in another sphere, right? So they don't really mix in terms of their power. So, for example, the federal government is responsible for foreign policy in dealing with other countries. The states can't do that, right? On the other hand, the states are responsible for public schools. The national government can't do anything about that, okay? So in those cases, there's a specific power guaranteed to the national government, specific power guaranteed to the state government. The other type, which is marble cake federalism, is a lot like cooperative federalism. So this is when the state government and the national government work together to do stuff. So this could be something like building a highway program, right? Part of it is within a state, so that would be regulated by the state government, but it also crosses outside of those state boundaries. So with cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism, there's a blurred distinction in what those powers mean. or who has those powers. If you want to like take a picture of that or anything, can. The other type of federalism that I wanted to talk about was fiscal federalism. So this has to do with money. So some examples are spending and taxing and providing grants. Most of the times, fiscal federalism falls under cooperative federalism, or there's like a mix, right? So light or marble cake. So there's a few different types of money related things you need to know. Categorical grants, block grants, and mandates are a few of them. So with categorical grants, this means that the grant is given to a state for a specific reason. So for example, the US could give North Carolina some money specifically to build a new airport. North Carolina can't use that money to fund their public schools. They have to use it to build an airport, okay? On the other hand, a block grant is money to the state government for very broad purposes, right? So for example, public health. Well, there's a lot of different places that state could use that money where it would still benefit public health, right? So states prefer block grants because they could spend it, maybe some in public health, but some also in education, and some in welfare, because it allows the state to spend money as it sees fit. So it gives them a lot more freedom. So a block is like a big chunk of money and they're like, you can do whatever you want with it. Categorical grants, it's like you're giving them the money, but only if they use it for the purpose that you're telling them to use it for. A mandate is basically instructions or a rule that's told to the states and you're like, you have to follow this, like you must, right? A lot of times these include civil rights mandates, like saying you can't discriminate. So the American Disabilities Act and what that caused, that is an example of a mandate. An unfunded mandate is when the state or the local government has to provide those funds. So the federal government might say, we're mandating you to do this, but then the state has to find the resources to cope with that and make sure that they're following that mandate. Okay, so there's a few more things that we're going to talk about in 1.8, which is constitutional interpretations. So there's a few clauses that are important within the Constitution. The first one is a Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause basically says the national government is superior or takes precedent over the state government, okay? It also says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Essentially, what the Supremacy Clause does is that federal law is greater than state law or holds greater weight than state law. There's also the Commerce Clause, which has really been extended to include a lot of different things. The Commerce Clause basically says that the US can regulate, or the national government can regulate interstate commerce, which means commerce beyond your state borders. And we have really stretched the meaning of that, the federal government has. And then the Necessary and Proper Clause, what this did was increase the power of the federal government because it said, basically whatever laws you feel are necessary and proper, you can do, right? And it really just goes with that constitutional interpretation. So the first case we're going to talk about is McCulloch versus Maryland. And basically what had happened was the national government decided to charter a bank in Maryland. However, Maryland didn't really want it there. So it decided to pass a law that imposed taxes on the bank. And the person who served as a cashier at the bank decided not to pay the tax, okay? So the state court ruled that the bank was unconstitutional and they had to pay the tax because the bank was in Maryland state borders. So the issue that this case explored was, does Congress have the power to create a bank? And then beyond that, can states tax a federal bank or a federal entity? So Congress concluded, based on the Necessary and Proper Clause, that Congress is not limited by those express powers. And it was decided that through implied powers, the government did have the ability to create a bank. So this was another issue in that case about, like, should the US even be allowed to create a national bank? So because of implied powers in that Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress could create a bank. So that was what this case established. The second case, or the second thing, was that Congress concluded that since those federal laws were superior to state laws, the state couldn't just tax the federal government. Okay, So that's one of the key things that you can get from this case. So the first thing is saying that implied powers exist. So even though it doesn't say in the Constitution that Congress can create a national bank, Congress still can because of that necessary and proper clause. And then the second thing is that national laws are superior to state laws, and states can't just tax the federal government. Okay? The second case is US versus Lopez. This was a case that involved the Gun-Free School Zone Act of 1990. Basically, this stated that individuals couldn't have guns within school zones because of the Commerce Clause. So remember, the Commerce Clause says that the US government can regulate interstate commerce, so commerce between states. Okay, so this case explored this constitutional issue. And in the ruling, the law, so that Gun-Free School Zones Act, which said you couldn't have guns on school grounds, it didn't affect interstate commerce, right? So it's not like it had a huge impact on that. There weren't like transactions or stuff moving or trading from a state to another state. And therefore, it can't really be justified by the Commerce Clause. So Congress can't just say, well, yeah, we're going to do this because of the Commerce Clause. Okay. So it introduced a new phase of federalism, which recognized that there is some state sovereignty. So McCulloch versus Maryland limited the power of the federal government, whereas US versus Lopez, I apologize. McCulloch versus Maryland strengthened the power of the federal government and limited the power of the state government. On the other hand, US versus Lopez said that the state government can't just do anything it wants, and neither can the federal government, right? But here it said that states' rights are protected, but the Commerce Clause didn't grant Congress limited power. Hopefully that makes sense. So really it was more looking at a federal law in limiting the power of the federal government with US versus Lopez. Sorry, got confused for a bit because I'm looking at the wrong notes on here. Okay, the last standard was just federalism in action. So US versus Lopez, like I said, ushered in this new wave of federalism, right? So devolution, what that means is that there's a movement of powers from the federal level to the state level. Generally, devolution is favored by Republicans because Republicans believe in a weaker federal government and stronger state government. And this relates to that US versus Lopez case because that case limited the power of the federal government and strengthened the power of the state government. And this is just something straight from the College Board document. Basically, it's saying that we also have multiple access points through which we can influence that public policy. So it doesn't necessarily relate best with this standard, in my opinion, but it shows how we can influence policy, whether that's on the national level or on the state level. Some disadvantages to federalism could be that national policy making itself is constrained by the local interest. So that's something that you might want to consider, in that there's a small local interest, but a larger national issue. Who should you pay attention to? And this kind of goes with that idea of factions. So again, this is all of the stuff that we reviewed: democracy, key foundational document, principles of US government, and federalism. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat. And as always, remember to follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. If you have any questions, let me know. No problem. Thank you for coming and staying the whole time. And if that's it, I hope you take AP Government in the spring. That's it. Have a great day, and reach out if you have any questions. Bye.